Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Tonight we turn our attention to Miss Marple and the poison in the honeysuckle tea, a tale from the gentle village of St. Mary Mead. Here, beneath the climbing roses and behind the lace curtains, human nature reveals itself in quiet ways. Miss Jane Marple, that most perceptive of observers, finds herself drawn into a mystery that begins at a summer garden party and ends in a drawing-room revelation. The weapon is subtle, the motive complex, and the truth hidden beneath layers of affection and doubt. Pour yourself a cup of tea, dear listener. Settle into your favorite chair. Where are you listening from this evening, I wonder? Perhaps by a window overlooking your own garden, or beside a fire as the rain taps gently outside. In St. Mary Mead, appearances are everything and secrets are currency. What seems a simple case of poisoning will prove far more tangled than anyone expects. Miss Marple, with her knitting and her knowledge of human weakness, will unravel each thread with patient hands. Chapter 1. The afternoon sun filtered through the elm trees along the high street in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple paused at her garden gate, secateurs in hand, and surveyed the climbing roses that needed attention. Summer had arrived with its usual warmth and its usual crop of village events. Mrs. Bantry appeared at the corner, walking briskly despite the heat. She waved a cream envelope in the air like a flag of importance. "Good afternoon, Jane," she called. "Have you received yours yet?" Miss Marple smiled and opened her gate. "Received what, my dear Dolly?" Mrs. Bantry arrived slightly breathless and fanned herself with the envelope, the invitation to Constance Ashford's garden party. She always holds it the second Saturday in June. This year she has outdone herself, I hear. Paper lanterns imported from London and a string quartet. Miss Marple had indeed received her invitation that morning. She had set it on the mantelpiece between the clock and the photograph of her nephew Raymond. Mrs. Ashford was known for her hospitality and her excellent tea sandwiches. "I plan to attend," Miss Marple said. "It will be pleasant to see the Honeysuckle House gardens again." "She keeps them beautifully." Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, her voice dropping to that particular tone reserved for gossip. "Have you heard about the niece? Eleanor Ashford has returned from London quite suddenly. No warning at all." Miss Marple continued trimming a wayward rose stem. "Eleanor was away for some time, I believe, working as a companion to an elderly lady." Mrs. Bantry nodded vigorously. "That is the official story. But my cook knows someone who knows someone in London." There was some unpleasantness. Eleanor left under a cloud, though no one will say precisely what kind of cloud. Miss Marple did not respond immediately. She had learned long ago that silence often encouraged more information than questions. Mrs. Bantry continued. "Constance seems strained whenever Eleanor's name is mentioned. At the butcher's yesterday, Mrs. Price, the Ashford cook, said Eleanor arrived with only one small trunk. She had been living in Kensington with the old lady for nearly 2 years. Perhaps the position simply ended," Miss Marple suggested mildly. "Elderly employers do pass on." Mrs. Bantry looked sceptical. "Perhaps, but why the rush back to St. Mary Mead? Eleanor never showed much interest in village life before. She always said it was too quiet for her tastes." The two women parted after a few more pleasantries, and Miss Marple returned to her roses. She thought about Eleanor Ashford, a pretty girl with restless eyes and expensive tastes. It had been nearly 3 years since Miss Marple had seen her last. The day of the garden party arrived with perfect weather. Miss Marple wore her best summer dress and her second-best hat. She walked slowly down the lane toward Honeysuckle House, enjoying the scent of cut grass and blooming hedgerows. Honeysuckle House stood at the edge of the village, a gracious Georgian building with white columns and tall windows. The gardens wrapped around 3 sides, filled with flowering shrubs and gravel paths. Today, tables dotted the main lawn, covered in white linen and laden with refreshments. Mrs. Constance Ashford stood near the entrance, greeting her guests with a warm smile. She was a handsome woman in her middle 50s, widowed for nearly a decade. Her late husband had been a solicitor of comfortable means, "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you," Mrs. Ashford said. "Please do help yourself to tea. The lemon cakes are particularly good today, thank you, Constance." "Your gardens are magnificent as always," Miss Marple replied, as she moved toward the tea table. Miss Marple observed the other guests. Dr. Haydock stood near the roses, discussing something with the vicar, Mr. Clement. Mrs. Bantry held court under a large oak tree, surrounded by several eager listeners. The string quartet played softly near the house, and there, emerging from the French doors, was Eleanor Ashford. The young woman had changed since Miss Marple last saw her. She was thinner, and there was a tightness around her mouth that suggested worry or disappointment. Her dress was fashionable, but showed signs of careful mending at the seams. She wore a necklace of garnets that caught the sunlight. Eleanor scanned the crowd, then fixed a bright smile on her face and descended the terrace steps. Several people greeted her, and she responded with appropriate warmth. But Miss Marple noticed how her hand kept rising to touch the garnet necklace, a nervous gesture repeated every few moments. Miss Marple had seen that gesture before. Years ago, a parlour-maid in her sister's household had touched her collar in exactly the same way. The girl had been caught stealing small items from the dressing table. The touching was an unconscious reassurance that the stolen object was still safely in place. Miss Marple settled at a table with a cup of tea and a small plate of sandwiches. From this vantage point, she could observe without appearing to do so. It was a skill she had perfected over many years. Eleanor moved through the guests with practiced ease. She spoke to Dr. Haydock, laughed at something the vicar said, and helped an elderly neighbour to a chair. But beneath the performance, Miss Marple detected strain. Mrs. Ashford watched her niece from across the lawn. When their eyes met, Mrs. Ashford smiled, but the smile did not reach her eyes. There was something watchful in her expression, something that suggested doubt or concern. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Family relationships were often more complicated than outsiders realized. A sudden return, whispers of scandal, and now this careful distance between aunt and niece. It reminded her of the Barton family in Little Paddocks, where the nephew had arrived claiming bankruptcy and left 6 months later with his uncle's entire savings. The afternoon progressed pleasantly. The quartet played selections from Mozart and Handel. Guests wandered the paths, admiring the flower beds and the small fountain that trickled musically near the wall. Children played croquet on the side lawn under the supervision of their mothers. Miss Marple found herself joined at her table by Dr. Haydock, who lowered himself into a chair with a satisfied sigh. "Excellent spread as always," he said. "Mrs. Ashford knows how to host a proper party." "She does indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "I understand her niece has returned to live with her." Dr. Haydock reached for a cucumber sandwich. "Yes, Eleanor came back about a fortnight ago. I saw her at the chemist's last week. She seemed well enough, though perhaps a bit worn down." "London life does not suit everyone," Miss Marple nodded. "It must be a comfort to Mrs. Ashford to have family nearby again." "The house is rather large for one person." The doctor chewed thoughtfully. "I suppose so. Though between you and me, Jane, I wonder if Constance is entirely pleased about it. She has been independent for a long time. Sharing one's household can be difficult after years of solitude." Before Miss Marple could respond, Eleanor herself approached their table. She smiled warmly at the doctor. "Dr. Haydock, I wanted to thank you for the tonic you sent round last week. Aunt Constance says it has helped her sleeping tremendously." Dr. Haydock waved a hand dismissively. "Nothing dramatic, my dear. Just a mild sedative." "Your aunt has always been a light sleeper." Eleanor turned to Miss Marple. "I do not believe we have been properly reintroduced. I am Eleanor Ashford, Mrs. Ashford's niece." Miss Marple shook her hand gently. "Jane Marple. I remember you from several years ago before you left for London. You must find St. Mary Mead quite changed." Eleanor's smile wavered slightly. "Not so very changed. It is peaceful here. That is something I have come to appreciate more than I once did." She excused herself after a few more polite exchanges and moved toward another group of guests. Miss Marple watched her go, noting again the nervous touch to the necklace, the forced brightness of her manner. The party continued until early evening. As the sun began to lower, guests began their farewells. Mrs. Ashford stood by the gate, thanking everyone for coming. She looked tired, and Miss Marple noticed her leaning slightly against the gatepost for support. "Are you quite well, Constance?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Mrs. Ashford straightened immediately. "Perfectly well, thank you, Jane. Just a long day on one's feet. I shall have an early night." As Miss Marple walked home in the gentle dusk, she reflected on the afternoon. A garden party was a mirror of village society, revealing relationships and tensions to those who knew how to look. Eleanor Ashford carried secrets, that much was clear. Whether those secrets were dangerous remained to be seen. The evening air smelled of honeysuckle from the hedgerows. Miss Marple paused to appreciate the scent, sweet and slightly cloying. In nature, she thought, honeysuckle was both beautiful and invasive. Its vines could strangle other plants if left unchecked. An apt metaphor for certain human relationships. She continued home, her mind turning over the small observations of the day. Human nature, she had found, was remarkably consistent. The patterns repeated themselves in drawing rooms and cottages, in cities and villages. If one paid attention, the truth often revealed itself in small gestures and unguarded moments. Tomorrow she would tend her garden and perhaps visit Mrs. Bantry for morning tea. Life in St. Mary Mead moved at its usual measured pace. But beneath that calm surface, currents ran deep. Chapter 2. Morning arrived with mist hanging low over the fields beyond Miss Marple's cottage. She was in her kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the rapid knock at her front door. It was barely 8 o'clock, an unusual time for callers. Mrs. Bantry stood on the doorstep, still in her dressing gown with a coat thrown over it. Her face was flushed from hurrying. "Jane, have you heard? Mrs. Ashford is terribly ill. Dr. Haydock was called to Honeysuckle House in the middle of the night." Miss Marple stepped aside to let her friend enter. "Come in, Dolly. Sit down and catch your breath. What exactly has happened?" Mrs. Bantry settled at the kitchen table, accepting the cup of tea Miss Marple poured. "My cook heard it from the milkman who heard it from Mrs. Price, the Ashford cook. Constance was taken violently ill around midnight. Terrible stomach pains and vomiting. Eleanor telephoned Dr. Haydock immediately." Miss Marple sat down opposite her friend. "Has the doctor determined the cause?" Mrs. Bantry shook her head. "Not yet, but Mrs. Price is beside herself. She swears there was nothing wrong with the dinner. Everything was prepared fresh and properly cooked." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Sometimes illness comes from sources other than food. A virus, perhaps, or reaction to medication." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "That is just it, Jane. Mrs. Price says Constance drank her usual cup of honeysuckle tea before bed. She has done so every night for years. It helps her sleep. But last night, something was different." The two women sat in silence for a moment. Through the window, Miss Marple could see her garden awakening in the morning light. The roses were covered in dew. "I shall call on Dr. Haydock this morning," Miss Marple said. "Perhaps he will have more information by then." After Mrs. Bantry left, Miss Marple dressed carefully and walked into the village. The doctor's surgery was located on the high street, above the chemist's shop. Miss Marple found him in his consulting room, looking tired and concerned. "Jane, I assume you have heard?" he said, without preamble. "Mrs. Bantry was kind enough to inform me. How is Mrs. Ashford this morning?" Dr. Haydock rubbed his eyes. "Stable but weak. I have sent samples to the laboratory for analysis. The symptoms suggest some form of poisoning, though I hesitate to use that word prematurely." Miss Marple settled into the chair across from his desk. "Poisoning implies intent. Might it be accidental contamination?" The doctor sighed. "That is what I hope to discover. Constance insists she ate and drank nothing unusual yesterday. Her routine was entirely normal. Dinner with Eleanor, a small glass of sherry afterward, and then her customary cup of honeysuckle tea. Before retiring, Miss Marple's fingers traced the handle of her handbag. This honeysuckle tea, how is it prepared? Dr. Haydock consulted his notes. Mrs. Price makes an infusion from dried honeysuckle flowers grown in the honeysuckle house garden. She prepares it fresh each evening and leaves it in a pot on the kitchen table. Constance comes down around 10 o'clock to collect it and takes it up to her bedroom. Miss Marple considered this information carefully. So the tea sits unattended for some time before Mrs. Ashford drinks it. I suppose so. But who would tamper with it? The household consists only of Mrs. Ashford, Eleanor, and Mrs. Price. The daily maid had left by 4 o'clock yesterday. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She was thinking about honeysuckle, that climbing plant with its sweet-scented flowers. The flowers were harmless, often used in teas and tisanes. But the berries, which appeared later in the season, contained toxins that could cause severe illness. Dr. Haydock, might I ask about the honeysuckle plant itself, Miss Marple said. Are there berries present at this time of year? The doctor looked surprised. No, honeysuckle berries do not appear until late summer or autumn. At this time of year, there would only be flowers. Why do you ask? Miss Marple smiled gently. Simply a thought. The berries are poisonous, as I understand it, but you say the flowers are safe for consumption? Quite safe. Constance has been drinking honeysuckle tea for years without ill effect. Whatever made her sick last night, it was not the honeysuckle itself. They were interrupted by a soft knock. Eleanor Ashford stood in the doorway looking pale and exhausted. She wore the same dress from yesterday's garden party. Her eyes were red from crying or lack of sleep. Dr. Haydock, I apologize for disturbing you, she said. I wanted to ask if there is any further news. Any change in Aunt Constance's condition? The doctor rose and offered her his chair. Please sit down, my dear. Your aunt is resting comfortably. I will call again this afternoon to check on her progress. Eleanor sank into the chair gratefully. This is my fault. I should have noticed something was wrong earlier. She seemed tired after the party, but I thought it was simply the exertion. Miss Marple spoke gently. You must not blame yourself, Eleanor. Illness can come on very suddenly. Eleanor looked at her with desperate eyes. But what if it is not simple illness? What if someone meant harm? Dr. Haydock mentioned poisoning. That word keeps echoing in my mind. Dr. Haydock raised a calming hand. I said the symptoms suggested poisoning. That could mean many things, from contaminated food to an accidental overdose of medication. We must wait for the laboratory results before drawing conclusions. Eleanor twisted her hands in her lap. Aunt Constance takes digitalis for her heart. Could that be the cause? The doctor made a note. She takes a very small dose, carefully measured. But I will certainly consider that possibility. Do you know if she took her digitalis yesterday? Eleanor nodded. She took it with breakfast, as always. I saw her myself. After Eleanor departed, looking slightly reassured, Dr. Haydock turned back to Miss Marple. You are thinking something, Jane. I can always tell. Miss Marple smiled. I am thinking about household routines and how easily they can be disrupted. A cup of tea sitting unattended provides opportunity. But opportunity alone does not make a crime. The doctor looked troubled. Eleanor stands to inherit Honeysuckle House and Constance's estate. It is not a vast fortune, but it would provide security. A young woman in financial difficulty might find such an inheritance very tempting. Miss Marple rose to leave. Financial difficulty is a powerful motive, certainly, but before we assume the worst of anyone, we must understand what actually happened. The laboratory results will tell us much. She walked slowly back through the village, observing the familiar sights with thoughtful eyes. The chemist was opening his shop, the postman made his rounds, and Mrs. Bantry waved from her front garden. At the baker's, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Price, the Ashford cook who was purchasing bread. The woman looked distraught, her usually neat appearance dishevelled. Miss Marple approached her gently. Mrs. Price, how distressing this must be for you. I do hope Mrs. Ashford recovers quickly. Mrs. Price's eyes filled with tears. I do not understand it, Miss Marple. I prepared everything so carefully. Nothing was spoiled or past its freshness. And the honeysuckle tea, I have made it the same way for 5 years. Miss Marple patted her arm. I'm certain no one blames you. Sometimes these things simply happen. But Mrs. Price shook her head. There's something I did not mention to the doctor. I do not wish to cause trouble, but it weighs on my conscience. Miss Marple waited patiently. The baker's shop was empty except for them. Mrs. Price lowered her voice. The honeysuckle tea that evening. I did not actually make the final pot. Miss Eleanor insisted on preparing it herself. She said she wanted to do something helpful to give her aunt a special blend with extra honey. Miss Marple absorbed this information calmly.
And did you see Eleanor prepare the tea? Mrs. Price nodded.
She did it right there in the kitchen while I cleaned the dinner dishes. She used the dried honeysuckle from the jar, added hot water, and stirred in honey from the pantry. Everything seemed quite normal. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Price and continued home. The morning had provided much to consider. Eleanor had prepared her aunt's tea personally on the very night Mrs. Ashford fell ill. It could be innocent coincidence, or it could be something far more sinister. She thought again of that nervous gesture, the hand touching the garnet necklace. Eleanor was hiding something, that much was certain. Whether that something was connected to Mrs. Ashford's illness remained to be proven. In her sitting room, Miss Marple took out her knitting. The rhythmic click of needles helped her think. Human nature, she reflected, was remarkably predictable. Desperation drove people to acts they would never consider in ordinary circumstances. A young woman in disgrace, fleeing London under a cloud, suddenly dependent on an elderly aunt for shelter and support. What might such a person do to secure her future? The question hung in the air like the sweet scent of honeysuckle on a summer evening. Chapter 3. Rain began to fall that afternoon. A gentle, steady rain that darkened the gardens and turned the lanes to mud. Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the drops trace patterns on the glass. Her knitting lay in her lap, the needles still for once. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She rose and found Eleanor Ashford on her doorstep, soaked despite her umbrella. The young woman's face was streaked with tears. "Miss Marple, I apologize for arriving unannounced. I did not know where else to go." Miss Marple drew her inside immediately.
"Come in, my dear."
"You are quite drenched." "Sit by the fire while I make tea." Eleanor sank onto the sofa, trembling slightly. Miss Marple brought towels and a warm shawl, then busied herself with the tea things. Sometimes, she had found, people needed time to compose themselves before speaking. When they were both settled with teacups, Eleanor finally looked up.
"Everyone thinks I poisoned Aunt Constance. I can see it in their faces. Dr. Haydock is too polite to say so, but he suspects me."
And why should he not? "I prepared her tea that night." Miss Marple sipped her tea calmly. "Did you tell Dr. Haydock that you prepared the tea yourself?" Eleanor nodded miserably. Mrs. Price told him this morning. She felt she had to. "I do not blame her for speaking the truth." Miss Marple set down her cup. "Eleanor, why did you prepare your aunt's tea that particular evening?" The young woman wiped her eyes.
"I wanted to do something kind for her."
She had worked so hard to make the garden party perfect. "I thought adding extra honey and making the tea with special care would show my gratitude." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "Eleanor, I believe you should tell me the truth about why you left London. Secrets have a way of becoming more damaging when they are hidden." Eleanor was silent for a long moment. The rain pattered against the windows. Finally, she spoke in a low voice. "I was dismissed from my position with Mrs. Thornbury. Items went missing from her home. Small things at first. A silver letter opener, a jade figurine, a valuable pen. Suspicion fell on me because I had access to all the rooms." Miss Marple did not interrupt. She had learned that silence encouraged confession more than questions. Eleanor continued.
"Nothing was ever proven. Mrs. Thornbury's grandson searched my room and found nothing."
But the suspicion was enough. She asked me to leave. Without a reference, I could not secure another position. I had nowhere to go except back to Aunt Constance. "Did you take the items?" Miss Marple asked gently. Eleanor met her eyes. "No, I swear I did not." "But I know who did, and I could not prove it." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Who did you suspect?" Eleanor twisted her hands together. "Mrs. Thornbury's grandson, Gerald. He had gambling debts. I saw letters from creditors hidden in the library, but he was family, and I was merely a paid companion. Who would believe me over him?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "So you sacrificed your reputation to protect yourself from direct accusation?" Eleanor's voice broke.
"I had no choice."
"If I had accused Gerald, he would have turned everything against me. At least this way there were no formal charges, just whispers and ruined prospects." The vicar, Mr. Clement, arrived shortly afterward. He had come to visit Miss Marple and was surprised to find Eleanor there. His kind face showed immediate concern when he saw her distress. "My dear Miss Ashford, what troubles you?" he asked. Eleanor explained her situation again, more calmly this time. Mr. Clement listened with the patient attention he gave to all confessions. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I believe you are telling the truth," he said finally. "Guilt has a particular quality that I have learned to recognize. I do not sense it in you." Eleanor looked at him with desperate hope. "But will anyone else believe me? I prepared the tea.
I have debts.
I inherit if Aunt Constance dies. Every circumstance points to my guilt." Miss Marple poured fresh tea for all of them. "Circumstantial evidence can be misleading. The truth often lies beneath the obvious surface." "Eleanor, tell me about your aunt. How would you describe your relationship with her?" Eleanor thought carefully. "Aunt Constance has always been kind but distant. She fulfilled her family duty by taking me in when my parents died, but we were never close. She preferred her solitude and her gardens. When I went to London, I think she was relieved to have her house to herself again. And when you returned," Miss Marple prompted. Eleanor sighed. "She received me politely, but without warmth. I could tell my presence was an inconvenience. She asked very few questions about my reasons for coming back. It was as if she preferred not to know." Mr. Clement spoke thoughtfully. "Perhaps she suspected trouble but did not wish to confront it directly. Some people avoid unpleasantness by simply not inquiring too deeply," Miss Marple agreed. "Constance has always valued propriety and the appearance of family harmony. An uncomfortable truth would disrupt that carefully maintained facade." Eleanor looked between them.
What should I do?
"If Aunt Constance dies, I will be accused of murder. If she lives but never awakens fully, I will spend my life under suspicion." Miss Marple spoke firmly. "First, we must establish what actually poisoned your aunt. Dr. Haydock is waiting for laboratory results. Second, we must understand who had opportunity and motive. And third, we must consider that the most obvious solution is not always the correct one." Eleanor seemed to draw strength from Miss Marple's calm certainty. "You believe me, then? You do not think I tried to kill my aunt?" Miss Marple chose her words carefully.
I believe you are frightened and desperate.
"I believe you are hiding some truths and revealing others. Whether you poisoned your aunt, I do not yet know. But I intend to discover what really happened." After Eleanor left, looking slightly more composed, Mr. Clement remained behind. He accepted another cup of tea and regarded Miss Marple with curiosity. "You have doubts about her innocence?" Miss Marple nodded. "She is not telling us everything. Her story about the London dismissal may be true, but there are gaps. Why did she bring only one small trunk if she had been living in Kensington for 2 years? Where are the rest of her belongings? The vicar considered this. Perhaps she left in great haste, or perhaps she sold everything she owned to pay debts," Miss Marple suggested. "A young woman with expensive tastes and no income might find herself in serious financial trouble." They discussed the matter for some time, turning over possibilities and examining motives. Mr. Clement was a shrewd observer of human nature despite his charitable inclinations. Together, he and Miss Marple made a formidable investigative pair. As evening approached and the rain continued, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. She thought about Eleanor's nervous gesture with the necklace. She thought about the prepared tea and the convenient timing of the illness. She thought about Mrs. Ashford's strained smile when watching her niece at the garden party. Families, she reflected, were often the most dangerous relationships. Love and resentment intertwined until it was impossible to separate them. An aunt who took in a disgraced niece out of duty rather than affection. A niece who returned not with gratitude, but with hidden resentment and need. The pattern reminded her of the Cabot family, where the daughter had nursed her mother with apparent devotion while slowly administering poison. The motive had been inheritance, but the deeper truth was decades of suppressed anger and unfulfilled life. Was Eleanor another such case? Or was she truly innocent, caught in circumstances that appeared damning but were merely unfortunate coincidence? Miss Marple set aside her knitting and looked out at the rain-washed garden. Tomorrow she would call on Mrs. Price again. Cooks knew household secrets that others missed. They saw the small interactions, the moments of tension, the unguarded expressions. The truth was there, waiting to be uncovered. It always was. One simply needed to look in the right places and ask the right questions. And sometimes, Miss Marple thought with a slight smile, one needed to remember that human nature was remarkably consistent across all walks of life. The poisoner in St. Mary Mead followed the same patterns as the poisoner in London or Manchester or any village in England. Desperation, opportunity, and a willingness to cross moral boundaries. These were the elements that transformed ordinary people into criminals. Whether Eleanor Ashford possessed all three remained to be seen. Chapter 4. Morning arrived with clearing skies and the fresh scent of rain-washed earth. Miss Marple walked through the village toward the constabulary, where Constable Polk kept his small office. She had received word that Mrs. Price was being questioned again, and she wished to observe. Constable Polk was a capable man, thorough if not particularly imaginative. He greeted Miss Marple with respectful politeness and allowed her to sit in the corner while he spoke with Mrs. Price. The cook sat rigid in her chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her face was pale and her eyes showed she had slept poorly. "Mrs. Price, we need to go through the events of that evening once more," Constable Polk said. "Dr. Haydock has confirmed that Mrs. Ashford was indeed poisoned. The laboratory found traces of digitalis in quantities far exceeding her normal medication dose." Mrs. Price nodded without speaking. The constable consulted his notes. "You stated that Miss Eleanor Ashford prepared the honeysuckle tea herself that evening. Is that correct?" "Yes," Mrs. Price said quietly. "I told her it was not necessary, that I always prepared Mrs. Ashford's evening tea. But Miss Eleanor insisted. She said she wanted to do something special. Did you observe her the entire time she prepared it?" Mrs. Price hesitated. "I was washing dishes at the sink. My back was turned for some of it, but I saw her take the dried honeysuckle from the jar, add the hot water, and stir in honey. It all seemed perfectly normal." "Where is Mrs. Ashford's digitalis medication kept?" the constable asked. Mrs. Price's voice dropped lower. "In the kitchen cupboard with the other medicines. Dr. Haydock provides it in a brown bottle with clear dosing instructions." Constable Polk leaned forward. "Could Miss Eleanor have accessed that bottle while you were not looking directly at her?" A long silence filled the room. Miss Marple remained perfectly still, observing Mrs. Price's internal struggle. The cook was a loyal woman, devoted to her employer. But she was also honest, and honesty was pulling her in a painful direction. "She could have," Mrs. Price finally admitted. "The cupboard was within reach. If she moved quickly while my back was turned, she could have added something to the tea." Constable Polk made careful notes. "Is there anything else you have remembered? Any other detail that might be important?" Mrs. Price looked at her hands. "There is one thing.
I have been reluctant to mention it because it seems disloyal."
But I suppose I must." The constable waited patiently. Mrs. Price took a breath. "The week before Miss Eleanor returned, Mrs. Ashford asked me about her will. She wanted to know if I thought it was proper to leave everything to a niece who had barely written in 2 years. I told her it was not my place to say." "And what did Mrs. Ashford decide?" Miss Marple asked gently from her corner. Mrs. Price turned to her. "She said she would wait and see. She wanted to observe Miss Eleanor's character now that she had returned. Mrs. Ashford is not a foolish woman. She knows that desperation can change people." After Mrs. Price was dismissed, Miss Marple remained with Constable Polk. The constable looked troubled. "It appears quite straightforward, does it not?" he said. "Miss Eleanor returns needing money. Her aunt is considering whether to maintain her as the sole heir. An overdose of digitalis in the evening tea could solve all her problems." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It does appear that way. Perhaps too straightforward." The constable looked surprised. "You think there is more to it?" Miss Marple rose and moved to the window. "I think Mrs. Price is protecting someone." Her confession felt rehearsed, as though she had prepared herself to say certain things while avoiding others. "Who would she protect?" the constable asked. Miss Marple did not answer directly. "Mrs. Price has been with the Ashford household for many years. Her loyalty runs deep. If she believed Mrs. Ashford herself was involved somehow, she might shape her testimony to avoid that truth. Constable Polk looked shocked. "You cannot mean that Mrs. Ashford poisoned herself." Miss Marple turned from the window. "I mean that we should consider all possibilities before settling on the obvious one. Human behavior is rarely as simple as it first appears." She left the constabulary and made her way to the baker's, where she purchased fresh scones. Then she walked to Honeysuckle House, where she found Mrs. Price in the kitchen preparing lunch. The cook looked startled to see her. "Miss Marple, I did not expect visitors." Miss Marple set down the scones.
"I thought you might appreciate these."
"I imagine you have had little time to shop for yourself with all this trouble." Mrs. Price's eyes filled with tears at the kindness. "Thank you. I confess I am at my wit's end."
"I do not know what to think or whom to trust." Miss Marple sat at the kitchen table. "Mrs. Price, I believe you are a truthful woman caught in a difficult position."
"You have said what you felt you must say to the constable. Now I ask you to tell me what you truly believe." Mrs. Price sank into the chair opposite. She was silent for a long moment, wrestling with her conscience. Finally, she spoke. "I do not believe Miss Eleanor deliberately poisoned Mrs. Ashford. The girl has faults, certainly. She is vain and careless with money, but she is not evil." I watched her face when she realized how ill her aunt had become. "That was not the face of a poisoner." "Then what do you think happened?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Price twisted her apron. "I think, and this sounds mad, but I think Mrs. Ashford might have done something to herself. I have worked for her for 15 years.
I know her moods and her ways.
Recently she has been strange, distant, thoughtful in a way that suggests she is planning something." Miss Marple felt a flutter of confirmation. Her instinct had been correct. "What specifically made you think this?" Mrs. Price spoke slowly, choosing her words with care. 2 days before the garden party, I found Mrs. Ashford in the kitchen late at night. She was at the medicine cupboard, examining the digitalis bottle. When I asked if she needed help, she said she was simply checking the dosage. But her manner was odd, secretive. Miss Marple absorbed this. Did she know that Eleanor would prepare the tea that night? Mrs. Price shook her head.
"I do not think so."
Miss Eleanor's offer to help was spontaneous. But perhaps Mrs. Ashford found a way to use that circumstance to her advantage. Dr. Haydock arrived at that moment, making his afternoon call to check on his patient. Miss Marple greeted him in the hallway. "How is Mrs. Ashford today?" she asked. Dr. Haydock looked tired, improving slowly. "She is conscious now and able to speak, though still very weak."
"I have just been with her. Has she said anything about the poisoning?" Miss Marple inquired. The doctor frowned.
"That is the curious thing. She insists it was an accident. She says she must have taken her digitalis dose twice by mistake, but that seems highly unlikely given her careful nature, unless it was not a mistake," Miss Marple said quietly. Dr. Haydock stared at her. "Jane, what are you suggesting?" Miss Marple chose her words carefully. "I am suggesting that Mrs. Ashford is an intelligent woman who understood exactly how much digitalis would make her very ill without killing her. I am suggesting that she may have wanted to test her niece's response to her illness." The doctor's expression shifted from confusion to understanding. A test. She poisoned herself to observe how Eleanor would react, to see if the girl would show genuine concern or guilt. Miss Marple nodded. It would explain many things: Mrs. Price's conviction that Eleanor is innocent, Mrs. Ashford's insistence that it was an accident. The convenient timing after Eleanor's return. Dr. Haydock sat down heavily on the hall bench. "Good Lord, that is either brilliant or deeply disturbed. Perhaps both." They went together to Mrs. Ashford's bedroom. The patient lay propped on pillows, her face still drawn but her eyes alert. She looked unsurprised to see Miss Marple. "Jane, I wondered if you might visit," Mrs. Ashford said. "You always did see more than others." Miss Marple sat beside the bed. "Constance, I believe you owe your niece and your household an explanation. This supposed accident has caused great distress." Mrs. Ashford closed her eyes briefly. "You have guessed, then?" "I thought you might." Dr. Haydock stepped forward, his professional concern evident. "Mrs. Ashford, if you deliberately overdosed on digitalis, you took a tremendous risk. You could have died." Mrs. Ashford smiled faintly. but I did not.
I measured very carefully.
I wanted to be ill enough to require attention, but not ill enough to die.
I needed to know if Eleanor would nurse me with genuine care or merely go through the motions while waiting for her inheritance. And what did you learn? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Ashford's expression softened.
I learned that despite her faults, Eleanor has a good heart. She sat with me through the night, holding my hand and weeping.
No one can fake that kind of distress.
I was wrong to doubt her so deeply. Miss Marple felt both relief and concern. Your intentions may have been understandable, but the consequences have been severe. Eleanor is suspected of attempted murder. Mrs. Price is tormented by guilt. The entire village is in turmoil. Mrs. Ashford looked stricken. I did not consider how it would spread beyond my household. I thought only of my need to know the truth. Dr. Haydock spoke firmly. You must make a full statement to Constable Polk immediately. Eleanor's reputation must be cleared without delay. Mrs. Ashford nodded wearily. I will. I have been a foolish old woman letting suspicion poison my judgment. Eleanor deserves better from me. Chapter 5. 3 days after Mrs. Ashford's confession, the village of St. Mary Mead settled back into its usual rhythms. Eleanor's name was cleared, though some whispers persisted among those who enjoyed speculation more than truth. Miss Marple observed the gradual return to normalcy with satisfaction, but also lingering questions. She sat at her writing desk, composing a letter to an old friend in London. Miss Caroline Weston had been her companion during a London visit some years earlier. Caroline had worked as a secretary in Kensington and knew the households of that respectable district. The letter was carefully worded,
asking after Caroline's health and mentioning, as if in passing,
that Eleanor Ashford had recently returned from a position with a Mrs. Thornbury. Miss Marple expressed curiosity about the circumstances, as one does when concerning oneself with young people of the village. She posted the letter and settled in to wait. Patience, she had learned, was essential in unravelling human mysteries. Meanwhile, her nephew, Raymond West, visited from London for a few days. He was a successful novelist, modern in his sensibilities and often impatient with village life, but he loved his aunt and tolerated her interest in what he called petty local dramas. Aunt Jane, you cannot seriously believe there is more to this story, he said, over tea in her sitting room. The woman confessed to poisoning herself. The niece is innocent. Mystery solved. Miss Marple poured more tea, perhaps, but I find myself troubled by Eleanor's account of her London dismissal. Something does not quite fit, Raymond sighed. You always find something that does not fit. That is because human beings are messy and contradictory. Not everything is a puzzle to be solved. Miss Marple smiled. Nevertheless, I have written to Caroline Weston. She may be able to provide some context. Raymond shook his head fondly. You and your network of informants. You should have been a detective. I am simply an observant old woman, Miss Marple replied. Now tell me about your new book. Raymond was deep into a description of his latest literary project when Mrs. Bantry arrived, slightly breathless and clearly bursting with news. She had encountered Eleanor in the village, and the girl had seemed unusually agitated. She was at the post office, Mrs. Bantry reported. She sent a telegram to London. I could not help but notice she seemed quite anxious about it. Perhaps she is following up on employment prospects, Miss Marple suggested. She will need to secure a new position eventually. Mrs. Bantry looked doubtful. She asked the postmaster if telegrams could be traced or intercepted. Rather an odd question, do you not think? Raymond laughed.
Village life,
where sending a telegram becomes a subject of intense speculation. But Miss Marple did not laugh. She filed the information away carefully. An anxious telegram to London, concerns about interception. Eleanor was still hiding something. 2 days later, a letter arrived from Caroline Weston. Miss Marple read it carefully, then read it again. Her expression grew thoughtful as the pieces began to arrange themselves differently. Caroline wrote that she had made inquiries among her circle in Kensington. Mrs. Thornbury's household was well known in the neighbourhood. The old lady had died 3 months ago, leaving a complicated estate. Her grandson Gerald had indeed been in financial difficulties, but Caroline added a detail that changed everything. Gerald Thornbury had been questioned by police about the missing items from his grandmother's home. No charges were filed, but whispers suggested he had sold family heirlooms to pay gambling debts. Eleanor Ashford had left the household shortly before Mrs. Thornbury's death, not afterward, as she had implied. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, reassessing the entire situation. Eleanor had not been dismissed after Mrs. Thornbury's death. She had left before, which meant her departure had nothing to do with the missing items. So why had she left, and why had she lied about the timing? She telephoned Raymond, who was staying at the inn in the village. "Could you make some inquiries for me in London? You have connections in literary and social circles that I lack." Raymond arrived within the hour, curious despite his earlier skepticism. "What precisely do you want to know?" Miss Marple handed him the letter from Caroline. "I want to know why Eleanor Ashford really left Mrs. Thornbury's employment. The theft story may be partially true, but it is not the whole truth." Raymond read the letter carefully.
"I can telephone some people."
"The Thornbury name is known in certain circles. Give me a day or two." Raymond was efficient when motivated. By the following afternoon, he had gathered information from 3 separate sources. He returned to Miss Marple's cottage with a grim expression. "Aunt Jane, your instincts were correct. Eleanor was not dismissed because of theft. She left because she was involved in an inappropriate relationship with Gerald Thornbury. The man is married, and there was concern that his wife would discover the affair. Miss Marple absorbed this news without surprise. So Eleanor fled scandal of a different kind. She came to St. Mary Mead not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she needed to escape a situation that threatened her reputation even more seriously than accusations of theft." Raymond nodded.
"Gerald paid her off, according to my sources."
"A sum of money to leave quietly and speak nothing of their relationship. But Eleanor apparently spent the money quickly and found herself penniless within weeks. That explains the single trunk," Miss Marple said. "She left in haste with whatever she could carry, probably in the middle of the night. She came to her aunt as a last resort, with no resources and no prospects." "But why lie about the theft?" Raymond asked. "Why claim she was dismissed over missing items when the truth was a secret love affair?" Miss Marple considered carefully. Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "That is not our decision to make. Eleanor has been cleared of poisoning. Her past, however sordid, is her own burden to carry. Unless it threatens others, we have no obligation to expose it." "But she lied," Raymond protested. "To her aunt, to the entire village." Miss Marple met his eyes.
"Most people lie, Raymond."
"They lie about their pasts, their feelings, their motives. Eleanor's lies were born of desperation and shame. She made poor choices, certainly, but she is not evil. She is simply a young woman who lost her way and is trying to find solid ground again." Raymond sat down, somewhat subdued. "You always manage to complicate what seems simple. I came here expecting a straightforward village mystery, and instead I find layers of deception and moral ambiguity." Miss Marple smiled. "That is because human nature is never straightforward. We like to believe in clear categories of good and evil, but most people exist in the grey spaces between." They sat in companionable silence for a while. Outside, the summer afternoon drifted toward evening. The long shadows stretched across Miss Marple's garden. "What will you do with this information?" Raymond finally asked. Miss Marple folded Caroline's letter and placed it in her desk drawer.
"I will do nothing."
"Eleanor has a chance now to rebuild her life honestly. Whether she takes that chance is up to her. But I will watch, as I always do, and if she threatens harm to others, then I will act." Raymond prepared to return to London the next morning. As he said goodbye to his aunt, he shook his head with affectionate exasperation. "You are the most unsentimental moral philosopher I know, Aunt Jane." Miss Marple laughed softly. "I simply pay attention, dear, to what people do, not merely what they say. Actions reveal character far more reliably than words." After Raymond departed, Miss Marple returned to her routine of gardening and knitting and observing village life. But she kept Eleanor Ashford in her peripheral vision, watching for signs of either redemption or further deception. The girl walked through St. Mary Mead with her head high now, her reputation restored. But Miss Marple noticed the shadows that still haunted her eyes. Eleanor had escaped immediate disaster, but she carried her secrets like stones in her pockets. Eventually, Miss Marple thought those stones would either weigh her down completely or she would find the courage to let them go. Time, as always, would reveal which path Eleanor chose, and Miss Marple, as always, would be watching when that revelation came. Chapter 6. Sunday morning arrived with church bells ringing across St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple dressed in her best summer suit and walked slowly to St. Stephen's, where Mr. Clement would deliver his weekly sermon. She enjoyed these quiet rituals, the familiar hymns and the gentle wisdom of the vicar's words. The church was moderately full, as it usually was in summer when visitors from London swelled the congregation. Miss Marple took her customary seat near the middle, where she could observe without being too prominent. Eleanor Ashford sat near the front with her aunt, who had recovered enough to attend services again. Mrs. Ashford looked frail but determined, her hand resting on Eleanor's arm in a gesture that suggested forgiveness and renewed trust. Mr. Clement's sermon concerned the parable of the prodigal son. He spoke of forgiveness and second chances, of how judgment often prevents us from seeing the redemption possible in others. Miss Marple wondered if the theme was deliberately chosen with Eleanor in mind. After the service, the congregation mingled in the churchyard. Miss Marple spoke briefly with several neighbours, accepting their observations about the weather and the upcoming village fete. She was about to leave when Mr. Clement approached her. His expression troubled. "Miss Marple, might I have a word in private?" he asked quietly. They walked together to the vestry, away from the chattering crowd. Mr. Clement closed the door and turned to her with evident concern. "I have been wrestling with my conscience for several days," he began. "I witnessed something the night of Mrs. Ashford's garden party, and I am uncertain whether I should speak of it now that the immediate crisis has passed." Miss Marple settled into a chair. "Tell me what you saw, Leonard. Sometimes speaking a thing aloud helps clarify one's duty." Mr. Clement paced the small room. It was late, perhaps 11 o'clock. "I had been visiting old Mrs. Henderson, who is bedridden. On my way home, I passed Honeysuckle House. The main lights were off, but I saw a figure in the garden moving along the path toward the kitchen door." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "Did you recognize this person?" The vicar hesitated.
"I believe it was Eleanor Ashford."
The figure was slender and moved with a particular gait. Eleanor walks with a slight hesitation, favouring her left foot. "I noticed it when she climbed the church steps this morning." Miss Marple recalled her own observation of Eleanor at the garden party. The vicar was correct about the distinctive walk. What was Eleanor carrying? Mr. Clement stopped pacing.
"A small basket covered with a cloth."
"I assumed at the time that she was simply taking something from the garden, perhaps herbs or flowers for the house, but now you wonder if the basket contained something else," Miss Marple said gently. The vicar nodded miserably. "I feel disloyal even suggesting it. Eleanor has been cleared of wrongdoing. Mrs. Ashford confessed to poisoning herself. But I cannot stop thinking about that figure in the garden, moving so purposefully toward the kitchen entrance. What time did Mrs. Price leave the kitchen that evening?" Miss Marple asked. Mr. Clement consulted his memory. "She mentioned during questioning that she finished cleaning around 9:30 and retired to her room above the carriage house. The kitchen would have been empty after that." Miss Marple sat quietly, piecing together the timeline. Mrs. Ashford claimed to have poisoned herself, but what if Eleanor had also tampered with the tea? Two people acting independently, each with their own motives and methods. It would explain certain inconsistencies. "Should I tell Constable Pelk?" Mr. Clement asked. "I do not wish to revive suspicions against Eleanor unfairly, but if there is more to this situation than we understand, perhaps the information is relevant." Miss Marple rose and moved to the window overlooking the churchyard. Eleanor and her aunt stood together by the gate, speaking with Dr. Haydock. From this distance, they appeared as a portrait of familial reconciliation. "Leonard."
"I believe we should speak with Dr. Haydock first," Miss Marple said.
"He has the medical expertise to help us understand what actually happened that night. If Eleanor did add something to the tea independently of her aunt's actions, We need to know what and why. They found Dr. Haydock at his surgery an hour later. He listened carefully to the vicar's account, his expression growing increasingly grave. This complicates matters significantly, the doctor said. Mrs. Ashford admitted to taking additional digitalis herself before drinking the tea, but the amount found in her system was higher than her admission suggested. I attributed the discrepancy to confusion or faulty memory on her part. Now I wonder if there were two sources of digitalis that night. Could you determine if two different administrations occurred? Miss Marple asked. Dr. Haydock shook his head.
Not with certainty.
The drug was fully absorbed by the time I treated her, but the severity of her symptoms was greater than I would
expect from the dose she claimed to have taken, Missy.
Marple turned to Mr. Clement. You saw Eleanor returning to the house. With a basket around 11 o'clock, Mrs. Price prepared the tea and left it on the kitchen table around 9. Mrs. Ashford came down to collect it at her usual time of 10 o'clock. The vicar followed her reasoning. So if Eleanor went to the kitchen after 11, the tea would already have been taken upstairs. She could not have tampered with it then, unless, Dr. Haydock said slowly, she prepared a second cup to replace the original. If Mrs. Ashford had not yet drunk the first cup, Eleanor could have substituted her own version. Miss Marple felt the pieces shifting again. Or perhaps Eleanor added something to the original blend before Mrs. Ashford drank it. A thoughtful niece bringing her aunt an extra touch of honey or herbs to help her sleep. The three of them sat in troubled silence. The implications were serious. If Eleanor had indeed added more digitalis to tea that already contained an overdose, she could have killed her aunt entirely by accident. Or worse, she could have intended to kill her, not knowing that Mrs. Ashford had already poisoned herself. Dr. Haydock spoke firmly. We must confront Eleanor directly. If she did tamper with the tea, she may have committed attempted murder, regardless of Mrs. Ashford's own actions. Intent matters under the law, Miss Marple agreed, though her heart was heavy. The girl had seemed genuinely distressed by her aunt's illness. But genuine distress could arise from guilt as easily as from innocence. They arranged to meet at Honeysuckle House that afternoon. Mrs. Ashford received them in her drawing room, looking puzzled by the solemn delegation. Eleanor was summoned from the garden where she had been cutting flowers. When everyone was settled, Mr. Clement spoke gently.
Eleanor, I must ask you a difficult question.
On the night of the garden party, after the household had retired, did you return to the kitchen? Eleanor's face went pale. Her hand rose instinctively to touch her throat where the garnet necklace rested. She looked at her aunt, then back at the vicar. Yes, she whispered.
I did. Mrs. Ashford looked shocked.
Eleanor, you never mentioned this. Why did you go back to the kitchen? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears.
I was worried about you, Aunt Constance.
You had seemed so tired and strained. I thought perhaps your heart medication needed adjusting. I went to check the digitalis bottle to see how much you had been taking. Miss Marple spoke quietly.
And what did you do when you found the bottle? Eleanor twisted her hands together. I saw that you had taken your dose that morning.
But I also saw, and this frightened me, that the level in the bottle seemed lower than it should be.
I thought perhaps you had accidentally taken too much. I nearly woke you to ask, but I did not want to alarm you unnecessarily. So you did nothing? Dr. Haydock asked. Eleanor shook her head. I did not tamper with anything.
I simply checked the bottle and left.
I went back to my room and tried to sleep, but I was worried all night. Mr. Clement leaned forward. Eleanor, I saw you in the garden that night carrying a basket toward the kitchen.
What was in the basket? Eleanor looked confused.
A basket. I was not carrying a basket. I went through the house, not the garden.
The front door was still unlocked. The vicar's certainty wavered.
I saw someone who walked like you. I assumed it was you. Mrs. Ashford spoke suddenly, her voice strained. That was me.
I went to the garden to gather more honeysuckle flowers. I thought adding fresh blooms to my tea might make it more effective. I had been having terrible insomnia. Miss Marple felt understanding dawn. Constance, you gathered honeysuckle flowers in the dark. Did you also gather berries by mistake? Mrs. Ashford's face went white. There were berries on the vine.
I did not think they mattered. I only wanted the flowers. Could the berries have poisoned me instead of the digitalis? Dr. Haydock stood abruptly.
Honeysuckle berries are indeed toxic. If you ingested them in addition to the extra digitalis, that would explain the severity of your symptoms. You poisoned yourself twice, once deliberately and once accidentally. The room fell silent as this truth settled over everyone. Mrs. Ashford had not merely tested her niece. She had nearly killed herself through a combination of intent and carelessness. Eleanor began to cry softly.
Aunt Constance, why did you not simply talk to me?
If you had doubts about my character, we could have discussed them. Mrs. Ashford reached for her niece's hand. I am a foolish old woman. I let suspicion poison my heart just as I poisoned my own body.
Can you forgive me? Eleanor embraced her aunt, and the two women wept together.
Miss Marple, Mr. Clement, and Dr. Haydock quietly withdrew, leaving them to their reconciliation. Outside in the summer sunshine, the three exchanged looks of relief and lingering concern. Human folly, Dr. Haydock said, shaking his head. It nearly proved fatal. Miss Marple smiled sadly. But human love proved stronger. That is worth remembering. Chapter 7. A week passed in relative calm. Mrs. Ashford continued her recovery, growing stronger each day. Eleanor remained at Honeysuckle House, and the relationship between aunt and niece appeared genuinely warm. The village gradually ceased its speculation and moved on to other matters, but Miss Marple remained thoughtful. Something still troubled her about the entire sequence of events. She sat in her garden one morning, ostensibly weeding the rose bed, but actually turning the pieces of the puzzle over in her mind. Dr. Haydock found her there, his expression serious. "Jane, I received the final laboratory report this morning. There is something you should know." Miss Marple straightened, brushing soil from her gardening gloves.
Come inside, Timothy.
"You look as though you need tea and a comfortable chair." In her sitting room, Dr. Haydock spread several papers on the table. The laboratory conducted a more detailed analysis of the samples from Mrs. Ashford's case. The results are puzzling. Miss Marple poured tea and waited. The doctor pointed to a section of the report. The digitalis level was elevated, as we knew, but they also found traces of honeysuckle toxin, confirming Mrs. Ashford's accidental ingestion of berries. However, there is a third substance present in small quantities, monk's hood. Miss Marple's teacup paused halfway to her lips. Monk's hood, a conatum that is extremely poisonous. Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. Also known as wolfsbane.
Even a small amount can be fatal.
The quantity in Mrs. Ashford's system was not enough to kill her, but combined with the digitalis and honeysuckle toxins, it contributed significantly to her symptoms. Miss Marple set down her cup carefully. Where would someone obtain monk's hood? It grows wild in some areas, the doctor said, but more commonly it is cultivated in gardens. The flowers are quite beautiful, purple and hooded. Many people grow it without realizing its deadly nature. Does Mrs. Ashford grow monk's hood in her garden? Miss Marple asked. Dr. Haydock consulted his notes.
I made inquiries.
Yes, there is a patch of monk's hood near the back wall, mixed among other perennials. Mrs. Ashford told me she plants it because the flowers are lovely and deer avoid it. Miss Marple rose and paced slowly. So we have 3 poisons. Digitalis administered deliberately by Mrs. Ashford herself, honeysuckle berries gathered accidentally in the dark, and monk's hood from an unknown source. The question is whether the monk's hood was also accidental or if someone added it purposefully. Dr. Haydock looked troubled. Mrs. Ashford insists she did not knowingly ingest monk's hood. She is familiar with the plant and avoids touching it without gloves. She certainly would not add it to her tea. Then someone else did, Miss Marple said quietly. The doctor stood.
I must inform Constable Polk immediately. This changes everything.
What we thought was a foolish test by a suspicious woman may actually involve attempted murder after all. Miss Marple put a hand on his arm. Wait, before we raise alarms, let us think carefully. Who had opportunity to add monk's hood to the tea? Dr. Haydock considered. Eleanor prepared the tea in the kitchen while Mrs. Price was washing dishes. Mrs. Price herself could have added something earlier. Mrs. Ashford could have added it before drinking.
Anyone in the household had access.
Miss Marple moved to the window. Monkshood must be prepared in a specific way to extract its poison. Simply dropping a flower into tea would not be particularly effective. Someone with botanical knowledge would be required. The doctor's eyes widened. Mrs. Ashford has extensive knowledge of plants. She has been gardening seriously for decades. But would she poison herself with monkshood in addition to digitalis and accidentally honeysuckle berries? Miss Marple asked. That seems excessive even for a test of Eleanor's devotion. They decided to visit Honeysuckle House together. Mrs. Ashford received them in her sitting room, looking healthier but concerned by their serious expressions. Constance, we need to discuss the laboratory results, Dr. Haydock began.
A third poison was found in your system, monkshood. Mrs. Ashford's hand flew to her throat. Monkshood. But I never touched the monkshood. I know how dangerous it is. Could someone have added it to your tea without your knowledge? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Ashford looked genuinely frightened.
But who would do such a thing? Eleanor and Mrs. Price are the only other people in the household.
I cannot believe either would try to kill me. Miss Marple chose her words carefully.
Let us consider what we know. You deliberately took extra digitalis. You accidentally gathered honeysuckle berries. But the monkshood appears to have been added deliberately by someone who knew its properties. Someone who had access to your garden and your kitchen. Dr. Haydock added, the timing is crucial. When exactly did you drink the tea that night? Mrs. Ashford thought back. I came downstairs around 10 o'clock, as always. The tea was on the kitchen table in the pot Mrs. Price prepares. I poured a cup, added a small amount of milk, and took it upstairs. I drank it in my bedroom while reading before sleep, and Eleanor did not visit you before you drank it, Miss Marple confirmed. No, Mrs. Ashford said. She had already retired to her room. I did not see her again until she heard me being sick in the night and came to help. Miss Marple walked to the window overlooking the garden. May I examine your monkshood plants? They went outside together, Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock, and Mrs. Ashford. The garden was beautiful in the summer sunshine, filled with blooming flowers and buzzing bees. Near the back wall, partly shaded by an old oak tree, grew a patch of tall purple flowers. Miss Marple bent to examine them carefully without touching. Several of the flower stalks had been recently cut. The breaks were clean, done with scissors or shears rather than torn by accident. Someone has harvested monkshood flowers recently, she observed. Within the past week or so, Mrs. Ashford looked shocked.
I did not cut them.
I never handle monkshood without thick gloves, and even then I am cautious. Mrs. Price was summoned from the kitchen. She denied cutting the flowers and looked genuinely alarmed when told of their poisonous nature.
I would never touch something so dangerous, she insisted. That left Eleanor.
Miss Marple asked to speak with the young woman privately. They sat together on a bench near the rose garden, away from the others. Eleanor, Miss Marple began gently, did you cut flowers from the monkshood patch recently? Eleanor looked confused. The tall purple ones near the back wall.
I did cut some, yes. About a week ago.
I thought they would look lovely in a vase for the drawing room. What did you do with them? Miss Marple asked. Eleanor frowned, trying to remember. I brought them into the kitchen to arrange, but Mrs. Price saw me and became very agitated. She said they were poisonous and made me dispose of them immediately. I threw them on the compost heap behind the carriage house. Did you touch the flowers directly or use gloves? Eleanor's face paled as she understood the implication. I wore my gardening gloves, but after I disposed of the flowers, I washed my hands thoroughly, Mrs. Price insisted. She said even the residue could be dangerous. Miss Marple patted her hand reassuringly. Did you prepare any other food or drink in the kitchen after handling the monkshood? Eleanor thought carefully. Yes, I made myself a cup of cocoa that afternoon.
And oh heavens, I washed the teapot because it needed cleaning.
This was days before the garden party. Miss Marple felt the final piece slide into place. You washed the teapot with hands that had touched monkshood, even after washing. A small amount of toxin remained on your skin or under your nails. When you prepared your aunt's tea the night of the party, trace amounts of monkshood transferred to the brew. Eleanor stood abruptly, her face white.
I poisoned her.
Not deliberately, but through my carelessness.
Oh God, I could have killed her. Miss Marple stood as well. It was an accident, Eleanor.
A tragic convergence of circumstances. Your aunt poisoned herself deliberately with digitalis. She accidentally added honeysuckle berries, and you unknowingly introduced monkshood through cross-contamination.
None of you intended the full result, Eleanor began to cry. I am a curse on this household.
Everything I touch turns to disaster. Miss Marple spoke firmly.
You are not a curse. You are a young woman who has made mistakes, as all young women do.
But you also nursed your aunt devotedly when she fell ill. Your care and love helped save her life. That counts for something. They returned to the house where Dr. Haydock and Mrs. Ashford waited anxiously. Miss Marple explained her conclusion, carefully emphasizing the accidental nature of Eleanor's contribution to the poisoning. Mrs. Ashford embraced her niece. "We have both been foolish," she said.
I nearly killed myself testing you, and you nearly killed me through an innocent mistake.
Perhaps we should start fresh, with honesty and trust instead of secrets and suspicion. Dr. Haydock looked relieved. No crime was committed here, only human error compounded by unfortunate timing. I see no need to involve the constabulary further. Mrs. Ashford's recovery is what matters now, Miss Marple agreed. Sometimes the truth serves justice better when it remains private. This household has suffered enough without public scandal added to private pain. As she walked home through the afternoon sunshine, Miss Marple reflected on the complicated web of actions and intentions that had nearly resulted in tragedy. Human beings, she thought, were endlessly capable of hurting each other, sometimes through malice, but more often through fear. Pride and simple carelessness, the real poison, she decided, was not digitalis or honeysuckle or monkshood. The real poison was suspicion and the inability to communicate honestly with those we claim to love. Chapter 8. Summer deepened over St. Mary Mead. The gardens reached their fullest bloom, and village life settled into the drowsy rhythm of long hot days and cool evenings. Honeysuckle House stood quiet in its gardens, a place of healing now rather than mystery. Miss Marple sat in her parlour on a Tuesday afternoon, mending a torn hem on one of her dresses. The work was meditative, allowing her mind to wander over recent events. She had observed the gradual transformation of the Ashford household with satisfaction and continuing watchfulness. Mrs. Ashford had grown stronger in both body and spirit. She walked daily in her gardens now, often accompanied by Eleanor. The two women could be seen talking earnestly, rebuilding trust through honest conversation. It was a slow process, but a genuine one. Eleanor had changed as well. The nervous tension that had marked her manner was gradually easing. She still touched her garnet necklace occasionally, but the gesture had lost its furtive quality. She was learning, Miss Marple thought, to carry her past without being crushed by it. A knock at the door interrupted Miss Marple's reflections. Mrs. Ashford stood on the doorstep, holding a small basket covered with a cloth. She smiled warmly. "Jane, I have brought you some of my raspberry jam. I made it yesterday with Eleanor's help. I thought you might enjoy it." Miss Marple invited her in with pleasure. They settled in the parlour with tea and some of the fresh jam on scones. It was delicious, sweet but not too sweet, perfectly set. "You and Eleanor are looking well," Miss Marple observed. "The difficulties seem to have brought you closer rather than driving you apart." Mrs. Ashford nodded. "I have you to thank for that in many ways. Your discretion and wisdom helped us navigate a situation that could have destroyed our relationship entirely," Miss Marple demurred. "I simply observed what was there to be seen. You and Eleanor did the real work of reconciliation." Mrs. Ashford set down her teacup. "Jane, there is something I need to tell you. Something I have not shared with anyone else, not even Eleanor." Miss Marple waited with patient attention. Mrs. Ashford took a breath. "The night I poisoned myself, I did it not merely to test Eleanor. That was part of it, certainly. But there was another reason, darker and more shameful." "Go on," Miss Marple encouraged gently. Mrs. Ashford's voice dropped.
"I am lonely, Jane. Desperately, terribly lonely.
My husband has been dead for 10 years.
I have no children.
The house is large and echoing. When Eleanor returned, I saw a chance for companionship, but I was also afraid. Afraid she would stay only long enough to secure her inheritance and then leave me alone again. Miss Marple understood. So you created a crisis to bind her to you, to make yourself vulnerable so she would have to care for you. Mrs. Ashford nodded, tears in her eyes. It was manipulative and cruel. I risked my own life for emotional reassurance.
What kind of person does that?
Miss Marple spoke kindly. A person in pain. Loneliness is a terrible thing, Constance. It drives people to extreme measures. You are not the first to make yourself ill to receive attention and care. But I hurt Eleanor in the process, Mrs. Ashford said.
I made her suspect herself, doubt her own innocence.
That was unforgivable, yet Eleanor has forgiven you, Miss Marple pointed out. She has chosen to stay and rebuild your relationship. That speaks to her character and to her own need for family connection. Mrs. Ashford wiped her eyes. We have been talking, truly talking, for the first time perhaps ever.
Eleanor has told me about London, about her mistakes and her fears.
I have told her about my loneliness and my failures as a guardian when she was younger. We are learning to be honest with each other. Miss Marple smiled. That honesty is worth more than any inheritance. It is the foundation of genuine relationship. Mrs. Ashford leaned forward. Eleanor wants to stay in St. Mary Mead. She has asked if she can help me manage the household and perhaps assist with some charitable work in the village. She seems to have lost her taste for London society. Miss Marple considered this. Running away from one's past rarely works. But Eleanor is not running. She is choosing a quieter life, perhaps a better life for her particular temperament. Mrs. Ashford nodded. I have revised my will. Eleanor will inherit Honeysuckle House, but I have also established a trust that will provide her with income during my lifetime. She will not have to wait for me to die to have security. I want her to stay because she wishes to, not because she has no other choice. That is wise, Miss Marple said. It removes the element of desperation from your relationship. They talked for some time longer, discussing village matters and shared acquaintances. When Mrs. Ashford prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Jane, you see people very clearly. Too clearly sometimes. What do you see when you look at Eleanor and me now? Miss Marple considered her words carefully.
I see two women who have been given a second chance.
Whether they make the most of it depends on their continued commitment to honesty and kindness. But I believe you will succeed. You have both learned difficult lessons at a high cost. Those lessons are rarely wasted. After Mrs. Ashford left, Miss Marple returned to her mending. But her thoughts remained with the Ashford household and the complicated dance of human relationships she had witnessed. Later that week, Eleanor herself visited. She seemed more at ease than Miss Marple had ever seen her, her movements graceful rather than nervous. Miss Marple, I wanted to thank you personally, Eleanor began. Aunt Constance told me how you helped unravel everything. Without your observations, we might never have understood what truly happened. Miss Marple offered tea, which Eleanor accepted. They sat together in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window. I have been thinking about second chances, Eleanor said, about how rare they are and how easily they can be wasted.
I want to do better, to be better than I have been. That is a worthy goal, Miss Marple replied.
But remember that improvement is a process, not a destination. You will make mistakes. The question is whether you learn from them. Eleanor nodded.
I have been carrying so much shame about London.
About Gerald and the affair and the money and all of it. I felt like I was drowning in my own past. And now, Miss Marple prompted. Eleanor smiled slightly. Now I am learning to swim. Aunt Constance knows everything. I told her the whole truth, even the parts that reflect badly on me. She was disappointed but not cruel. She said everyone deserves a chance to start fresh. Your aunt is a generous woman, despite her own failings, Miss Marple said. You are fortunate to have each other. They talked of lighter matters after that. Eleanor mentioned her plans to start a small lending library in the village. She had some books from London and thought others might enjoy sharing volumes. Miss Marple encouraged the idea warmly. As summer progressed toward autumn, Miss Marple observed the continuing evolution of the Ashford household. Mrs. Ashford had begun hosting small gatherings again, and Eleanor served as a gracious co-hostess. The whispers and speculation gradually faded as the village found new subjects for discussion. One evening, as Miss Marple sat in her garden watching the sunset, she reflected on the case of the poison in the honeysuckle tea. It had not been a simple mystery with a clear villain and a dramatic unmasking. Instead, it had been a tangle of human weaknesses, each contributing to a near tragedy: Mrs. Ashford's loneliness and need for control,
Eleanor's desperation and poor judgment, Mrs. Price's loyalty and reluctance to speak difficult truths.
Even Mr. Clement's well-meaning but incomplete observation had complicated rather than clarified matters, and yet Miss Marple thought good had emerged from the darkness. Two women had learned to trust each other. Honesty had replaced deception. A household had been healed rather than destroyed. Not all mysteries, she reflected, required punishment and justice. Some required mercy and understanding. Some required the courage to forgive both others and oneself. The honeysuckle vine on her garden fence released its evening scent, sweet and slightly intoxicating. Miss Marple thought about how the same plant could be both beautiful and dangerous, depending on how one approached it. Rather like human relationships, she supposed. She rose and walked slowly back to her cottage as darkness fell. Tomorrow would bring new observations, new puzzles, new glimpses into the endlessly fascinating complexities of human nature. But tonight she was satisfied with the resolution of this particular mystery. Some truths she had learned long ago were better whispered than shouted. Some secrets served their purpose and then could be gently laid to rest. The poison had been real, but so had the healing that followed. In St. Mary Mead, life continued its measured pace. Gardens grew and faded with the seasons. People made mistakes and occasionally found redemption. And Miss Marple watched it all with keen eyes and a compassionate heart, understanding more than she ever revealed. The garnet necklace that Eleanor wore had been a symbol of her secrets and her shame. But Miss Marple noticed that Eleanor touched it less frequently now. Perhaps one day she would put it away entirely, or perhaps she would keep it as a reminder of lessons learned. Either way, it was Eleanor's choice to make, and Miss Marple, having helped guide her to a place where she could make that choice freely, was content to step back and observe from a distance. The candle in Miss Marple's window glowed steadily as she prepared for bed. Outside, the village slept under a canopy of stars. All was well for now in this small corner of the world. Candlelight outro. And so, dear listener, Miss Marple and the poison in the honeysuckle tea draws to its quiet close. The candle's flame glows steadily again. Its light rests gently on the revealed truth. In St. Mary Mead, peace returns and Miss Marple's knitting resumes. Each stitch reflects the tangled hearts of humankind. Until next time, dear listener, another secret fades by candlelight,